It looks like we are getting ready to get started, so I'm going to hand it over to Joe Noble to begin. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for joining our session. So the Applied Science and Management special session today will highlight the USGS burned area science products, along with the results of collaborative efforts between scientists and fire managers. We will discuss burned area products, highlight statewide and regional applications using those burned area products, and discuss additional research to improve the products that were a direct result of management input. The burned area toolset can be used by both researchers and managers alike to better understand fire impacts on the landscape. We'll have presentations from Casey Teske from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Branch of Fire Management, also Todd Hawbaker and Melanie Vanderhoof from USGS. Todd will be our first speaker. Todd will talk about Landsat burned area algorithm that identifies burned areas in dense time series of Landsat data and applies that across CONUS for the years 1984 to 2020. Dr. Hawbaker is a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey and Geosciences Environmental Change Center near Denver, Colorado. Todd?
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for that introduction. Let me just share my screen here. There you go. I think you guys can see my presentation now. All right. Well, thanks for joining today. And Joe, thanks for the introduction. I'm really excited to tell you about our efforts to map burned areas from the Landsat archive so we can monitor patterns of fire occurrence across the U.S. And I think this will set up a nice background for some of the other talks in our session. Before I begin, though, I do want to acknowledge and thank my co-authors. This has been a huge team effort, and I really appreciate all their help with it. So let's get started here. So accurate and complete fire data are critical for a number of applications, including quantifying patterns and trends in fire occurrence, or just identifying areas where change is occurring in the landscape, to characterizing the drivers behind those fire occurrence patterns, and then using that understanding to project future potential changes, maybe, for instance, under future climate conditions or different management scenarios, as well as we need those data to assess the impacts of fires on a range of human and natural systems. And there's many existing, really great fire data sets available for these types of applications. And this slide shows just a few examples. The top graph, or the top two maps, show Karen Short's fire program analysis fire occurrence database for fires greater than 1,000 acres on the left and greater than 10 acres in the upper right. There's also the monitoring trends in burn severity, or MTBS data. They map large fires across the US. These show their point locations in CONUS, but they also have perimeters and severity rasters to go with all of them. And then in the lower right, we have the MODIS active fire detections. And I think what's great about these data sets all have their individual strengths, but none of them are really perfect. The FBA and the MTBS products rely on agency reports to map fires, and those reports haven't exactly been consistent over time and over space. So there's varying monitoring effort. And the MODIS products do have that consistency over time and space. They're based on satellite imagery, but they lack the spatial resolution that many of us desire for our fire applications. So there's still a need to augment the existing fire data sets that we have with new burned area data sets that have been collected consistently over space and time, with finer spatial resolution than what these coarse resolution products are providing. So at USGS, we're responsible for managing the Landsat satellites and delivering the data that they collect. And so naturally, we saw a potential for remote sensing to fill this need. A few years ago, our team was tasked with producing a burned area product from the Landsat imagery. And following USGS's tradition of providing Landsat-derived products such as the MTBS burned area data or severity data, National Land Cover Database, or things like the land fire data sets that some of you might be familiar with. When we started the project, we recognized that there was already a large amount of work being done to remotely sense forest disturbances. So we wanted to really design an approach that would work in all major ecosystems so we could consistently apply it across the US to characterize patterns and trends in burned area. And finally, because we based our approach on Landsat, we really thought the results would have spatial and temporal resolutions suitable for large-scale assessments, as well as on-the-ground management applications. So in 2017, we first published our algorithm and our approach, as well as CONUS-wide mosaics for each year from 1984 through 2015. Back then, we called it the Landsat Burned Area Essential Climate Variable product. In addition to publishing the algorithm and products, we made a considerable effort to quantitatively validate the products. We strongly believe that this is an essential part of product creation, as it gives people using our products accuracy estimates that will help them determine how much confidence to have in them or if they're even useful for their application. For us, it also gives us a benchmark to try to beat as we make changes to the algorithm over time. And so that the usual approach that's been taken in the remote sensing community to validate the global coarse resolution-based products like the MODIS burned area products is to compare them to data derived from an alternative source of images that has a finer spatial resolution. So validating MODIS products with Landsat-based reference data. In our case, that kind of approach would work for more recent Landsat images where we can derive our validation data from commercial high-resolution satellite imagery, but it's not really a viable option over the entire length of the Landsat archive. Further back in time we go, the only option is to validate Landsat products with Landsat-derived reference data. And so thanks to Melanie Vanderhoof's efforts, we were able to validate our burned area essential climate variable products using reference data sets that were derived both from Landsat and high-resolution commercial imagery. She led these two papers that were also published in 2017, describing the approach we took there and the initial results for the burned area essential climate variable products. Since then, we've refined that algorithm to incorporate Landsat 8 data and utilize the analysis-ready data format that Landsat data are now being delivered in. We also did a lot to just kind of improve the processing efficiency of the algorithm to make it operational. And in a remote sensing of environment paper that came out last year, we published the changes to the algorithm and the products and updated the validation results, essentially rolling in all three of our 2017 papers into one large paper in 2020. We also streamlined the name and changed it to Landsat Burned Area Products. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here since these methods and results are the most up to date. So first, let's talk about how the algorithm works. We designed it to consistently monitor burned area across all ecosystems using every usable Landsat scene. And so for each scene, we produce a burn probability image using a gradient boosted decision tree that we train with Landsat derived predictors that include things like scene level spectral indices, such as the normalized burn ratio, the 3-year lagged mean and standard deviation of those indices, and then the change between the 3-year lagged mean and the scene index. During fitting, we subset our predictors to boil it down to about 10 predictors to improve our processing efficiency. And then once the models fit, we can use them to generate wall-to-wall probability images like this example shown for part of the Flint Hills in eastern Kansas. And in this image, the green pixels have a lower likelihood of being burned. The red pixels were more likely to have been burned. And you can see some burned areas that kind of clearly pop out of that image. Once we have that, the next step is to take it to a binary burned or unburned image. And we do that using a thresholding and segmentation approach. We first start by finding candidate burned areas using a really high probability threshold and a minimum patch size of 5 acres or about 22 connected pixels. And then we add in neighboring pixels if they meet a second lower probability threshold. And the black polygons outlined in black in this example image show the places that we mapped as burned from the burn probability surface image. And you can see also that there's some unburned islands in there. So we're capturing some of that within fire heterogeneity as well. All right, and then the next series of slides here is going to show a time series of Landsat images in our scene level products. So the first image on the left is the raw Landsat image. This date string is the date the image was collected. In the middle, we have the burn probability surface and then the burn classification. And as we move through image by image over time, we start to see the Allen Road fire that burned in Poquoson Lakes National Wildlife Refuge in North Carolina in 1985. You can see the cloud masks and the water masks are carried through. Sometimes water gets, or burned areas get mistakenly masked as water in the QA masks that come with the Landsat data. But luckily, as we move through the time series, we usually end up mapping burned areas in multiple images over time, and that helps us build our confidence in our burned area detections. So that's kind of what the time series look like for the scene level products. Those are also the products that our validation results are based on. We take image pairs for our products, and then we have corresponding image pairs that we've manually, we've used a semi-automated approach with manual cleanup to derive our reference data. And the value that we are validating is the amount of new burned area that's mapped from the first image to the second image in the image pair. So the table shows a summary of omission and commission errors for the two sets of published products calculated across CONUS using the Landsat reference data. If you're not used to omission and commission error, omission are burned areas that we missed. Commission errors are burned areas that we mapped that were probably not actually burns in real life. So you can see our original burned area essential climate variable products had omission error of 39% and commission error of 29%. And then the latest Landsat burned area product, we reduced commission error down to 25%, but omission error increased by 2%. And we've also looked at these errors across different land cover types. So it's shown in this graph here. You can see in the more managed land cover classes, such as cultivated crops and pasture and hay, our error rates tend to be higher, but omission errors also tend to be high in emergent wetlands, or emergent and woody wetlands. Those are kind of challenging environments to detect burned areas in. For the remaining sort of more wildland vegetation types like grasslands, shrublands, and forests, our omission and commission errors are right around 30%. So if those error rates sound high to you, they sounded high to us too. But luckily, there now have been a number of other burned area products that have published error rates. And it's difficult to make like apples to apples comparisons with these because everybody's using their own validation data set and they have different sampling intensities for those validation. But I think what we see here is that our products are in the ballpark of other recent studies that have developed burned area maps using Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2 products. And so that's encouraging. But when we compare any of these products based off of Landsat or Sentinel-2 to some of the more global products that are typically based off of MODIS, they make all of our products look quite good. Omission error rates for the coarse resolution products are nearly twice as high as any of the moderate resolution products, and commission errors range between 40 and 64%. So those are relatively high error rates, but people are using these products all the time to say, estimate like global fire emissions. All right, so in addition to the scene level products, we also generate annual composites by summarizing the pixel values across all the scene level products in a given year. These include things like the maximum pixel level burn probability, also the number of times that each pixel was classified as burned across all scenes in a year, date of year of the first Landsat image of pixel was detected as burned in, and then a filtered burn classification that removes burned areas that were in one year that were also mapped in previous years and have significant overlap, so we're not double counting. This filtered burn classification raster, we also convert to polygons, and then we attribute those polygons with the count of pixels in that polygon and in each NLCD class and summaries of these other three layers. So like average of the maximum burn probability or average detection date. All right, this map shows everything that we burned between 1984 and 2020. Nearly 1.4 million square kilometers of burned area over 37 years. That is equivalent to about 0.5% of the conterminous US burning per year, which makes fire one of the largest types of land change in the country. It sort of emphasizes why it's important to monitor it consistently over time and space. And hopefully in this image, you can see some large fires that you recognize, or at least hot spots of burning that you're familiar with. We were really excited when we started producing maps like this because we found many of the large fires that we see here in our backyard in Colorado or read or hear about in the literature and news but we also mapped many small fires that are really not mapped anywhere else with as much spatial detail as we provide. This was especially true in places like the Southeast and the Great Plains, where we know fire has a really important ecological role, but there's very few national scale data sets that consistently characterize patterns of burning there with in high detail. And so with these annual products, of course, we could subset them to whatever area of interest we have, or just summarize them across the entire country to look at trends in burned area over time. So it's nice. This graph, shows the year-to-year variability that we see with patterns of fire occurrence, but picks up large years like 2000, or I think that's 2010 or 2012. Sorry, I can't read my own graph. If we plotted other data sets like NTVS or the MODIS burned area products on here, they would of course be different, but they tend to have that same sort of year-to-year variability. They have a high level of correlation, which also gives us confidence in our products. All right. If you're interested in accessing any of our data for your own applications, our latest scene level products are delivered through USGS's Earth Explorer website. This is the same place that you'd visit to manually download Landsat data. Just look under the Landsat Collection 1 Level 3 products. We're there along with the Dynamic Surface Water Extent and Snow Cover products. And if you Google Landsat burned area, you should get this website here. It goes into a lot more detail about the file formats and the data they contain. The annual products we delivered through USGS's science-based catalog and also through our center's FTP site. These were generated for the individual Landsat sensors or scenes from the individual Landsat sensors, and then all sensors combined. Each year has a compressed tar file that contains all those annual level products, the 4 rasters in the shapefile that I described before. And recently, the awesome Google Earth Engine community data sets ingested our data, so you can they're publicly available through Google Earth Engine now. I think right now they're current through 2019, and we'll hopefully get the 2020 data on there. So if maybe you are Google Earth Engine users, this is a new way to access the data. All right, so just to summarize, I'm really excited because USGS is now providing consistent scene level and annual burned area products derived from the Landsat archive. And as much as I'd like to think our data are perfect, our validation results show that they're not. Our error levels are on par with other Landsat and Sentinel-2 based products, but they're much lower than the global coarse resolution products that are currently available. Just keep in mind the commission errors were high in agricultural land covers, so use our products with caution there. Outside of those areas in wildlands, we have a 37-year and growing product to monitor burned areas that are 5 acres or larger in size. And we think these are, we hope these are useful products to people because they're a really unique information source for understanding the patterns and impacts of fire, especially in areas where our agency fire records have been poor. And finally, we've got an active and growing community of stakeholders that we hope are benefiting from routine production and delivery of our products. I think you'll hear about some of those, some applications that they're using them for in our session here today. But we always love to learn more about how people are using our data, their experiences with the data, and what we might do to improve the data. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. And with that, I'll stop. I'm happy to take any questions here. Thanks for listening.
Great. Well, thanks a bunch, Todd. That was really great. And I'm not seeing any questions come through here in my WOVA app. So we'll move on. Hopefully we'll get some during the discussion at the end. Next up, we have Dr. Casey Teske, who is a fire management analyst at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, branch of fire management. And Casey's going to talk about using Landsat burned area products to map fire history metrics in Florida and the implications to conservation management and fire management planning and prioritization across the state and the region. So welcome, Teske, or Casey.
Thanks, Joe. As you can tell, I used to work with Joe, so I currently work at Fish and Wildlife Service, and today I'm going to talk about a project that we worked on when I was at Tall Timbers, where we use the burned area products in Florida to understand the burning within the state. So I'll be talking about the project and give you some background, and then I'll give examples of how some of those products can be used. So I'd first like to acknowledge that there were a lot of people that were very helpful in getting this project going. A lot of them are on this screen here, but we definitely got funding from Florida Wildlife Conservation Commission and Peninsular Florida Landscape Conservation Cooperative. And we also received pretty major assistance from the Fish and Wildlife Service, the USGS, Florida Forest Service, DOD, Eglin Air Force Base, and the National Park Service. So just wanted to acknowledge them. So developing complete and accurate spatially explicit fire occurrence data is pretty critical for fire managers, especially in the southeastern US and also around the world. We need this data to document fire patterns and quantify drivers, as well as assess impacts on human and natural systems. Data that record burned area locations through space and time provide critical information for evaluating management successes and identifying points of improvement. In the Southeast US, specifically Florida, which I'll be talking about today, many species rely on frequent fires, and fire management planning activities and analyses are reliant on fire characteristics information, including where and how fires burn, as well as how often. But existing fire occurrence data sets are known to be incomplete or have undocumented shortcomings that limit their use, especially if fire records are not required, which is often the case in private ownership. So we use the burned area products, as well as a handful of other data sets and input from fire managers to do this project. The burned area products that Todd just discussed, I'll go into a little bit, but they track the spatial extents of fires, and we can derive fire history metrics like frequency, time since previous fire, seasonality, and other things. And so we did this for the entire state of Florida for fires larger than 2.5 acres. And this project resulted in the first contiguous fire history mapping effort and fire regime characterization for Florida. And it's a first step in evaluating these products for a larger scale. And those results have implications for management. And it came together because we need to understand when and where fires are burning. It's a known issue that monitoring fires is important, especially on private lands, because they don't necessarily keep records on private lands. And there's a lot of prescribed fire done in Florida. Nearly 72% of the state is made up of private lands with no requirement for tracking their fire information. And that's also true in much of the Southeast. A large part is in private lands. There's a lot of fire-dependent species across the state. And in order to evaluate species conservation questions and apply a science to management, we thought it would be nice to know where fires were occurring in terms of the footprints of fires. So the objectives of this study were to assess existing fire data sets throughout Florida in terms of their strengths and weaknesses. We used 3 pilot areas with well-known fire occurrence and record keeping. We also utilized the burned area products as well as derived fire history metrics from those products. And we ultimately demonstrated how fire history metrics can be used to extend our knowledge of fire occurrence and inform conservation planning. So it was important to include managers in the whole process. We held a kickoff workshop. We highlighted existing examples of databases and frameworks, known fire data sets, and other potential data sources for fire information. And then these end users gave us information on how they could potentially use the data and some of the databases and the queries that we could be developing from this. And then we also asked them if they would provide data sets for their own ownership to help us analyze the data. But important to this whole thing is include managers throughout the whole process. So our data call provided us with about 20 different data sets from different landowners, and their fire history was used to validate different things like the satellite data sets and the burned area products. Only about half of those data sets are shown here, but you can see that there is no standard in terms of fire data sets within or among ownerships for the different types of data, but they can help us understand where and when fires in Florida are happening. So while we were waiting for the data sets to come in, we began exploring the Florida's open burning authorization, or OBA data set, which helps us to track prescribed burning in the state. All prescribed and pile burns are mapped and tracked at a state level, but it's a point data set and does not include spatial extent. So you can see that here. Here's a snapshot of one of those days from a couple years ago. But you can find a lot of good information. Florida burns a lot. Without counting sugarcane burning, which is a significant portion of burning in the southern part of the state, there's nearly 100,000 authorizations per year that account for more than 1.5 million acres and 120,000 piles per year. These authorization data also allow us to understand when and where burning is happening throughout the year, as well as across the years. We can also see the impact that drought years have on burning. So we're burning less in those prescribed fires during drought. We can spatially compare how the authorization is, the distributions change across years, as well as within a year on a monthly basis. And then with most of the state being in private ownership and no standardized tracking required on these ownerships, where are fires occurring? We initially thought that we would be able to use that OBA data set to help us find parameters and map satellite data and stuff, but it is difficult to determine which open burn authorization permits are associated with actual fires. Each red star here is associated with a given burn date. The red lines connect each star to a burn unit that was identified as having burned on that same date. In some instances, those authorizations might be up to 10 kilometers away from a unit. So if you're trying to assess things, species questions based on location, or validate satellite detection based on distances, you could have some issues. But they are very useful in characterizing fire and the scope of burning in Florida. As part of our process, we evaluated the satellite data. We looked at a number of different sources, but settled on the burned area products. And to instill some level of standardization across the data sets, we restricted our analyses to fires larger than 1 hectare, occurring between 2006 through 2016 initially, and then we extended that through 2018. But when we started this project, it was only through 2016. We focused initially on the OBA data set, that point data set I just shared, as well as the landowner provided data sets from 3 pilot areas: the Apalachicola Forest, Big Cypress Park, and Eglin Air Force Base. This was so that we could help landowners understand the strengths and weaknesses of the products for representing fire history in relation to information that they were already familiar with as we went through that process involving managers. So this is where each of those 3 pilot areas exists. Each of them has a large scale prescribed fire program and fire dependent ecosystems, as well as species of concern within the state. And they all keep records of both prescribed fires and wildfires. So comparing the data sets would help us understand the strengths and weaknesses of the Landsat products and how they might perform in other areas. We initially set a cutoff of 90% burn probability based on information from the managers, which is a little lower than what Todd shared, but we did use those annual burn probability products. And again, we mapped fires greater than 2.5 acres. So this 30-meter data set is pretty useful for finding small fires, which is a common, we definitely have small fires on private ownership. So we use those burned area products. They're standardized, they're replicable, and they're available nationally, and you're not required to, they're produced automatically. There's no trigger to produce these. They're documented in the literature. Todd just spoke about them, so I won't get into that. But we can be consistent across boundaries and landscapes, and I think that's important. So within a year, here's what some of those products look like. And again, we're looking at these annual summaries in number 4. Here's 2009, the beginning of the year. And as we move through the different year, you can see some of those same things that Todd just talked about. So Again, that was 2009. And if we look at as those tiles throughout a change of years, you can see that different years show different amounts of fire. One thing I want to point out real quick before we get into it is Todd talked about omission and commission. We know that there's a lot of burning in Florida. A known issue in Florida is cloud cover. There's rapid green up. There are low intensity fires, and we have a lot of fires throughout the state. So if we look at tall timbers, which is shown in this dark black outline, and we look at the fires that are detected throughout the year in different scenes, which are represented by these yellow outlines representing the annual burn area, you can see the differences. So if you pay attention to the areas in the northwest corner of tall timbers, as I move through this, you'll see how this changes throughout the year and how detection could be difficult in some instances in Florida. So this is a March image, here's a May image, and here's an October image. So without looking at all the images, if you only picked one, you might be missing some of those fires. So it is possible that fires are missed with the method due to rapid green up or low intensity fires or cloudy days. But that being said, it is the only product that is consistently available across ownerships, which is really important for Florida for mapping species conservation questions. This slide shows the differences another way. The points are up in the upper right. The landowner data set for Eglin Air Force Base is in the lower left, and the burned area product is in the lower right. And you can see that there is, even with omission and commission errors, we're getting a pretty similar pattern, but we're starting to see a mosaic. And we discussed these burn product maps with the managers and got consensus from them on things where places where the mapping was working well and places where it wasn't working as well. So we think we're capturing those ecologically significant fires. We cannot differentiate between wildfires and prescribed fires. And there are some instances where mapping is not as easily done. And Joe and Melanie will talk about some of that a little bit later. But I'll show you what the annual product looks like for the Appalachian National Forest, Apalachicola, sorry. Again, spatial representation by these products and standardized methods, that's a plus, but we might be missing some of the fires. And because we used an annual product, we could be getting attribution to a calendar year at the wrong time based on when these images are captured. So in most instances, you'll see the black areas with no red are, the black areas are the burn units. The red is the burn area detection. Black areas with no red are likely late year burn units that were not detected until the next calendar year by the satellite. So they might be misattributed in terms of the calendar year. And then the red areas without black could likely be the late year burns from the previous year that are shown on the slide. And also we might be missing some things due to things like cloudy days or wetlands and whatnot. So here's what the Apalachicola looked like in 2006. Here is what it looked like in 2008. We have 2009 and 2011. So after showing those kinds of maps to the different fire managers in relation with their the maps that they provided to us, in many instances, the burned area products were doing a great job of capturing the extensive fire on the landscape. And they provided a starting point for us to use these data sets to monitor fire history. So we generated fire history metrics using those 90% burn probabilities across the entire state. And of all the data sets we evaluated, it's the only one that consistently monitors those areas with spatial detail. And so what we came up with was we were able to determine how many times a place had burned. Again, here's an Apalachicola. It's an older slide, but you get the idea. This is a frequency. We were able to map time since previous fire. We were able to understand when the year that a place last burned and the longest fire-free interval. The methods were tested on all the areas, and Because it's so small, it's a 30-meter data set. We zoomed in on some of these, but we did produce this for the whole state. And when you compare them to each other, you can see that different patterns that start to emerge. So when you look at it statewide, again, it's zoomed out because it's small, it's hard to see. So we can aggregate the data for viewing and then zoom into that. But we can start to address those questions about how fire impacts things like indigo snakes or natural pine lands across different ownerships within the state. So here's a map of the indigo snake habitat and how often it burned on the Apalachicola. A frequent fire is required to maintain areas in suitable habitat for these snakes, and places that have lower fire frequencies might need to be looked at for burning in order to restore some of that habitat. So you can use these different types of metrics to answer some of those conservation questions like that. This is another one, it's a gopher tortoise. This is kind of the old-fashioned way of looking at that. And like I said, we created a spatial database to look at this stuff. So combining the gopher tortoise distribution for habitat, which is the top left map in the purple, as well as the time since last burn in the lower right, or no, number of times burn, I'm sorry, on the lower left. Putting those together on the Apalachicola gives us an idea of places that might not have burned or when they last burned within that time frame. But when we put them into that spatial database, we can start to ask specific questions like, show me where it's been more than 3 years since something has burned and gopher tortoises are present. I'll focus in on this blue square outside of Tallahassee. If you do a query like that within these kinds of databases, you can highlight specific areas that might need to be considered. And these kinds of queries can help managers highlight successes and identify areas of concern. Like I said, we'll be talking a little bit more about those kinds of things throughout the day, but this Landsat burned area product, based on manager feedback, we feel that the effort was worth expanding, specifically including much of the Landsat time series as possible and capturing information greater than 10 years than this project initially did. So Melanie and Joe will talk about that. With that, I don't have anything else. So if there's any questions.
Thanks a bunch, Casey. That was really great. Yeah. It's all new to me. Yeah. I am not seeing any questions in my app. Again, hopefully everybody's saving those for the discussion at the end. So next up, we have Melanie Vanderhoof, who will talk about mapping wetland burned area from Sentinel-2 across the southeastern United States and the potential for Sentinel-2 to support efforts to track burned areas across challenging ecosystem types. Again, Dr. Vanderhoof is a research geographer with USGS Geological Survey based in Denver, Colorado. It's all yours, Melanie.
All right, great, thanks. Joe, can you see the slide okay?
Absolutely.
Awesome, okay. All right, thanks everyone for taking the time to join the session. This project built directly upon the work that Todd presented, as well as the work that Casey had presented. And they're both co-authors on this effort, as is Joe Noble, Andrea Koo, and Josh Bacot. And this work was funded by the Land Change Science Program within USGS. This research, which is focused on mapping and improving efforts to map burned area within wetlands across the southeastern US, is published in the journal Fire this past August, in case you're interested in learning more about it. So wetlands are an ecosystem type that really provides a disproportionate number of critical ecosystem services, including removing pollutants and excess nutrients from water, limiting erosion, reducing flooding, and supporting biodiversity. And globally, wetlands cover only about 6% of the Earth's land surface, but they have been estimated to store between 20 and 30% of the global soil carbon, which is at risk of loss when a wetland burns. And wildfires and wetlands are actually quite common across the globe. Here are some headlines that I grabbed from online just from the last year or two. The largest tropical wetland, which is in South America, called the Pantanal, has had some really large fires the last couple of years. The Everglades routinely burns, as Casey had discussed, and peatland fires are common and can burn for months in places like Indonesia and the Arctic. But despite how important wetland fires are, existing products, including the Landsat burned area product, tends to show substantially higher rates of omission error in wetland cover types relative to other cover types like forests. And the global burned area products do not typically report accuracy statistics for the wetland cover type. And in general, there's really been limited efforts to remotely track wetland fires with satellite imagery. Most of the efforts that are out there tend to track the post-fire recovery within known wetland burn perimeters, instead of attempting to use the imagery alone to find wetland fires. And one of the major discouraging factors is that there can really be substantial spectral confusion between water and saturated areas and burned areas, which kind of discourages a lot of these efforts. In the southeastern US, wetlands is a major land cover type. It represents over 30% of the land area. But this region has some additional challenges. The weather is warm and rainy, and that means frequent cloud cover, like Casey had mentioned, can limit the number of clear sky images. And the vegetation regrows really fast. So there can be a limited window for burn detection. So you can see in the figure here on the left is two examples of wetland fires in Florida, and on the right is two examples of forest fires from Western US. And all of the dots there are NBR, normalized burn ratio, tracking them over time. And the red line is when the fire actually occurred. And so you can see in Western US, we've got a pretty long window to detect those fires. But if you're looking Florida wetlands, you've got maybe a month, maybe 2 months. And then that NBR is right back to pre-burn levels. And that means that change is no longer visible. So our research questions for this effort were, what is the contribution of clear sky observations from Sentinel-2 relative to Landsat 8? So how worthwhile is it to add Sentinel-2 to the mix? Can Sentinel-2 effectively map burned areas in wetland ecosystems? And what are the individual and combined contributions of Sentinel-2 and Landsat 8 burned area and wetlands? And how do they compare to verified wetland fire perimeters, which we got thanks to the efforts of Joe and Casey. So to develop our algorithm, we generated training data from 4 subregions where burned area points were restricted to wetland fire perimeters. And we tested a large number of spectral indices. And for each index, we tested the single scene value, the z-score value, the change from the monthly mean. And we also included tested a whole host of climate variables as well from GridMet daily climate data. Model variables were selected using a forward stepwise increase in the contribution to the model's AUC. And the hypothesis was that the change from the monthly variables, as well as the 30 and 90-day standardized precipitation indices, could help us distinguish the saturated areas from the burned areas. So we initially tested using random forest both within Google Earth Engine, as well as using a Python version of it from scikit-learn. We found that the Python version substantially outperformed the Google Earth Engine random forest algorithm, and that we could run the Python version and convert it into a format where the model could be readable by Google Earth Engine. We then applied the random forest model to the Sentinel-2 image collections in Google Earth Engine over a 4-year period across the Southeast. And the variables included in the model included a single scene MIRBI, BAI, and NBR, so all well-known fire indices, a Z-score variable, a few monthly change variables, including EVI and NDWI, normalized difference wetness index. So both of those are likely helping distinguish variability in saturation from burn. And both of our precipitation indices routinely were selected to be included in the model. So one challenge that we encountered was that during our 4-year period, there were 2 big hurricanes that hit Florida. First, Hurricane Irma was in fall 2017, was a Category 5 hurricane. It hit Florida as a Category 4 hurricane. Hurricane Irma hit tidal wetlands on the western coast of Florida, and it moved a lot of sand around. But the impacts we found dissipated pretty quickly in our model. Hurricane Michael, in contrast, hit as a Category 5 hurricane in fall of 2018. And it hit the Florida Panhandle and moved through a forested area. And the damage was severe and sustained. And it caused quite a bit of commission error, as you can see in our model. So the top is a paper from Zemperi that shows the hurricane force winds in pink there. And below spring 2019, so you can see this is the spring following the hurricane, and all of that is commission error. Most of that is commission error that's showing up in our model. You can compare that to spring 2018 pre-hurricane there at the bottom. We validated the algorithm using 27 Worldview 2 and Worldview 3 images. And the major challenge of validating with an on-demand source of imagery, like Maxar's, is minimizing the date gap between the high-resolution images and the corresponding images. The average date gap was 11 days between the Landsat 8 and the Worldview images, and 7 days between the Sentinel-2 and the Worldview images. We validated both our Sentinel-2 algorithm, and then we applied the same validation data set to the Landsat burned area product, specifically limited to the Landsat 8 images. So the product that Todd had discussed earlier for comparison. Our Sentinel-2 algorithm showed a 29% omission error for burned area, a 30% commission error. In comparison, the Landsat burned area product showed a higher omission error, 47%, but a much lower commission error, 8%. And this means that our Sentinel-2 algorithm found more wetland burned area, showed a more balanced estimate of total burned area with a low relative bias, but the Landsat burned area had much less false detection of fire, so a cleaner data set. When we look at the number of clear sky observations, we see that Sentinel-2 on an annual step by 2016 is contributing almost 170% more observations than using Landsat 8 alone. But by 2018, we've got 2 Sentinel-2 sensors flying, collecting data, and Sentinel-2 was contributing 380% more clear sky observations. And in the example on the right here, the zoomed in burnt areas, this is from the Everglades. And we can see that it's really in kind of 2018 and 2019, where we really start to see the value add of new burnt area being detected by Sentinel-2, that's in purple there, that is not being detected by Landsat 8 in red. The area that's being detected by both sensors is in like the yellow orangish color. In addition to the Everglades, we saw that Sentinel-2 is, so that's in purple on the left there, is identifying a similar pattern of wetland fires along the coast of South Carolina as Landsat. So Landsat is in the lower right here in red and yellow, and the MODIS burned area points. So we're doing a pretty good job in capturing the spatial patterns. And here's another example here. This is from apicola. I'm definitely mispronouncing that. I tried my very best to remember, Casey, how you just pronounce that. But it's in the Florida Panhandle and National Forest. And we can see if we focus on this lower right-hand box, that Sentinel-2, which is this neon green, is really contributing, identifying unique fires that are not found by Landsat 8, which is in purple here, and the area found by both sensors is in dark blue here. So we're starting to see that in some regions, we're really having a pretty substantial value add for including Sentinel-2. So in addition to the validation analysis, we wanted a more comprehensive way to test how well the Sentinel-2 algorithm could find wetland burnt area. So with the help of Casey and Joe, we compiled burn perimeters that overlapped the National Wetland Inventory wetlands from multiple nonprofit, state, and federal perimeter data sets. And the primary requirement was that these were manually verified fire perimeters and that they overlapped a wetland. We had a total of 555 burn perimeters over the 4-year period. And when we look at how well the Sentinel-2 algorithm found wetlands by wetland size, we can see that over 65% of wetlands, 10 hectares, over 10 hectares were detected. Over 80% of the fires were detected when we looked at fires that were larger than 50 hectares in size. And essentially all fires larger than 200 hectares were being found. And for context, MTBS as a general policy maps fires in the eastern US larger than 200 hectares. So we're starting to see a pretty big value add, particularly for the smaller fires here. We, however, also saw a pretty big bias of detection rate by wetland type. So 97% of forested and scrub shrub wetland fires were detected. That drops down to 73% for palustrine emergent wetlands, and only 37% estuarine and marine wetlands fires were detected. And that means that when things get really wet and really tidally influenced, we're still having a hard time detecting fires within from kind of the natural noise of the system. So in order to improve detection in estuarine and marine wetland environments, we may need to get more creative in our algorithm development. So in some cases, as you can see here on the right, fires can burn off the vegetation, leaving open water behind. And in other cases here, like you see on the left, we might totally miss the burn signal, but be able to catch that pop of green that can occur as an area recovers after the fire. We had initially tried to specifically target these types of non-traditional trajectories, but we found that these types of trajectories still are representing a minority of wetland burned areas, which made it challenging to reliably detect the fires with this way alone. However, future efforts, I think, are going to need to not only incorporate climate conditions and reference wetness conditions, but also include these non-traditional spectral trajectories, in addition to the more traditional spectral trajectories. So getting back to the value add of using Sentinel-2 in addition to Landsat 8, we also compared the ability of the USGS Landsat 8 burned area product to find those same wetland fires compared to the Sentinel-2 algorithm's performance. And we found that both by count and total area detected, that the Sentinel-2 found and mapped more wetland area as burned in every year except wetland area in 2016. So we were doing pretty good. On average, including the Sentinel-2 burned area led, in addition to the Landsat 8 burned area product, led to a 19% more wetland burned areas being found and 18% more by area being found within the wetland perimeters. So a pretty substantial value add here. When we zoom out to the entire study area, we found that the Landsat burned area mapped 1.1% of the National Wetland Inventory wetlands as burned per year. And you can compare that, Todd had mentioned that 0.5% of CONUS is mapped as burned each year, and this really demonstrates the prevalence of wetland fires. And the Sentinel-2 mapped 2% of the National Wetland Inventory wetlands as burned per year. And this really further demonstrates the value add of using Sentinel-2 together with Landsat 8. Geographically, we saw a pretty similar distribution of burned area with some minor differences in eastern Florida and in southern Georgia. So lastly, we also explored how the Sentinel-2 algorithm, which was trained entirely on wetland burned area, performed within burned areas that happened in forest environments in the region. So in this figure, the Sentinel-2 here is on the left panels. The coloring is the color of the NLCD land cover type, where that dark green is a forest. And we can compare that to the Landsat burned area product, Landsat 8 here in the middle, and to the MODIS active fire points in orange here on the right. And you can see that the Sentinel-2 algorithm is performing actually quite well in non-wetland environments, despite not being trained on that type of fire specifically. So in conclusion, this was the largest scale effort to date that we were aware of to specifically find and map wetland burned area. We were able to demonstrate that Sentinel-2 can effectively be used to map wetland burned area with a particularly big advantage from 2018 onwards. And that in ancillary data sets, and in particular climate data sets, can be of help to distinguish wet conditions from burn conditions. But we're still facing a lot of challenges when it comes to really wet and dynamic systems like tidal wetlands. But in general, an improved understanding of wetland fire occurrence, frequency, and extent is really quite critical for the effective management of wetland fuel loads, carbon storage, and of wildlife habitat. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions you might have, and I'll leave you with a lovely example of some Everglade wetland fires.
Thanks a bunch, Melanie. That's really, really exciting stuff. I'm not seeing any questions here in the app. Jessica, are you seeing any questions on your end?
I have not seen any questions come in just yet.
Okay, everybody is holding them for the discussion.
Looks great, Joe.
Okay, great. I'm Joe Noble. I'm a geospatial program director at Tall Timbers Research Station here in Tallahassee, Florida. And first off, I want to thank some of our team members here in the geospatial lab, both Eli, Karen, and Kurt, some of whom I think are watching, and they keep the show running. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we take this really great science and these products and bring them down to the management level, to that decision-making level, and how we can help folks and fire practitioners actually on the ground. So, and I want to talk a little bit about the Southeast Fire Map and how we expanded the Florida effort that Casey talked about that was developed here at Tall Timbers, and how we expanded that to the Southeast. So in 2020, NRCS funded an effort for scoping and development of a map to track both prescribed burn and wildfire activity that would serve as a decision support tool to maximize the effectiveness of prescribed burn practices on private lands. And that was to achieve varied objectives of NRCS and its partners, such as keeping wildlands working, restoring longleaf pine ecosystems, supporting Department of Defense and military training missions, conserving listed and at-risk species, and managing for wildlife risk, as well as minimizing the need for regulation of species. So what we're looking at here on this slide is the Southeast Fire Map through the Landscape Partnership Portal. And I was going to do a live demo of Google Earth Engine, but I thought better of it because it seems to lag sometimes when I do that. Okay, so to produce the Southeast fire map, basically during the scoping effort, we looked at, all sorts of different active fire products, burned area products. Todd had a great slide on that. We looked at the permit data that Casey talked about. And what we ended up with is to produce the Southeast fire map, we used the Landsat burned area developed by USGS. As these products are standardized and they don't rely on the fire reporting systems to trigger production. We have really good maps of fire, on public lands, but it's the private lands is where we're really interested in as far as directing these management decisions. You saw that, I think Casey's slide had 72% of Florida. So we used the burned area products and produced 26 years of fire history metrics. And the fire history metrics that we produced were time since previous fire, year last burned, fire frequency, and the longest fire-free interval across the whole entire historical range of longleaf in the Southeast. So this was all presented to NRCS in a Google Earth Engine viewer that was developed here at Tall Timbers. You can see, if I can get my pointer going here. It's a fairly simple viewer. It's got a pixel inspector. We're looking at Eglin Air Force Base here, Blackwater State Park. I kind of chose this area for this slide today because we all should be enjoying in about an hour the beach here in Destin, but alas, we're not. We can query each one of these fire pixels for this 26-year period. You can see I've clicked on one here. We've got a fire frequency of 2, time since previous fire, 3 years, and the year last burned, 2018, longest fire-free interval, 13 years. So why is this important? So we've known for over a decade that monitoring fires has been an issue in the Southeast, both on public and private lands, especially when it comes to answering conservation-related questions. And nearly 83% of the Southeast is made up of private lands with no standardized requirements for spatial tracking of fire data. In order to evaluate conservation management decisions, we need to know where the footprints of fire are occurring. So accuracy, completeness, and consistency of existing fire data sets are often uncertain and often located, as I said, only on public lands. So we'll talk about the permit database in a few minutes again, but remember that the burned area products represent that spatial footprint, unlike that permit data. So this is, Casey kind of stole my slide here. This was actually out of or I stole hers. This was actually out of the SQL database that we delivered to Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission with including the fire history metrics and also about 30 different layers, 30 different species habitat suitability indexes, and Florida has its own land cover map. So the take-home message from this is when we actually presented this and released the database was that, again, this was the Apalachicola National Forest, a small area here representing the Munson Sandhills, and the simple query of show me where gopher tortoises are present in the habitat suitability index and where the time since previous fire is greater than 3. So kind of the take-home message here is once the managers saw that, it's like, wow, that's something we can really use. And that's kind of, so just wanting to show that this is kind of where we were 4 years ago and try and show you where we're going with those efforts today. So one of the efforts that we've worked on as part of our Tall Timber strategic plan with our land conservancy is as a conservation prioritization model. So we work with the Land Conservancy to develop these different geospatial frameworks, and this is the main one, to strategically target lands for permanent conservation-based based on a variety of factors such as watershed, fire history, proximity to other conservation lands. And this ongoing work will continue to develop science-based tools to help identify at-risk conservation lands based on ecological values to justify that land protection. This will also encourage support and buy-in from public agencies and private conservation partners. So again, we're looking at here our conservation model, which is built. There's a link for Google Earth Engine. Here, this is a fairly simple conservation model where we used climate resilience, species habitat, land cover, proximity to other protected areas, and fire history. And this is an example here of what it looks like in Google Earth Engine. What the conservation folks and managers are able to do here is based on baseline scores based on existing conservation easements, is compare on a parcel by parcel basis what an actual score for an upland and wetland prioritization scenario. This is an example of a report that they might, I believe they're using in their easement review committee for easement approval. And we're looking here at a piece of property here with a score, it's an upland prioritization score of 4.98. So that's above the regional benchmark, which is 5.32 for all of our conservation easements. And to this, we can add, a biological survey and the narrative. So this is really a way to standardize a comparison of parcel versus parcel when we're going in trying to defend our choice of a parcel to create an easement on. So one of the things we're working on now is Tall Timbers has a private lands burn team as well as a burn team here that burns our various properties in the Red Hills. We've just started working on a prioritization model to serve those folks. This is a little bit more robust model and will probably turn into it'll probably inform that original conservation model that we just looked at. So within this, this top part here is the actual results from it. We are using the fire history metrics, time since previous fire. We may add some different fire history metrics to this. We're using upland species. This is Crawford et al. USGS, using 5 different fire-dependent species here. Gopher tortoise, gopher frog, striped newt, Florida pine snake, and southern hognose. Also using distance to our existing conservation lands, terrestrial ecosystems. This is Nature Serve that we actually came in and we derived our own from that using Nature Conservancy climate resilience. Clark Labs land cover vulnerability change, which is a little bit of variation. We had originally looked at using the sleuth models. This is really a pretty neat model here because it looks at all human impact on the land and how human impact converts that land to either urban areas, developed areas, agricultural, et cetera. Using the NRCS funded logleaf occurrence database. It was developed by Florida Natural Areas Inventory for NRCS. And we're looking at a kernel density estimation based on the permit data that we have just developed for the Southeast. So just to kind of give you a look at that, because I think it's a really cool slide of a heat map of 10 years worth of permit data with all the sugarcane burning excluded from this for the Southeast. All right, so where do we go from here? So this is it's an iterative process, really best described by Hires et al. 2003 paper, simple spatial modeling tool for prioritizing prescribed burning activities at the landscape scale. And so, emphasizing that it is an iterative process. So what we have not done to this point is sit down with those managers and see how, with all of those input layers, see how they actually value those, rate those, and rank them within the model. So, the idea of that being is these can be used, these models and model outputs can be used for a variety of different things, whether that be treatment optimization and prioritization, or identifying high quality conservation lands, as our Land Conservancy is doing, ranking conservation related projects and proposals, to developing metrics for success for cost share programs, and standardized methods to rank site potential. So this is the area, the pilot area here across the panhandle of Florida, that we're looking at as the pilot area. Again, over the next couple of months, we'll meet with those managers, that private lands burn team, our burn team, and figure out how we weight those values in the model. We'll mask out all public lands here, and then I believe we mask out all urban service areas and all parcels greater than 50 acres, which I think that may drop to 20. I'm not sure, that'll be up to them. And then basically the outputs here, we're looking at scale 1 to 9. This is some water management district property that is over in the middle of the panhandle, north of Destin. And we can see that we've got some fairly decent land around that that may be used to direct burn team efforts in the future. So that is all I have. And we'll stop here and go to discussion, or if anybody has any questions, that'd be great.
Well, I've got a question for you, Joe. I think that burn prioritization model is pretty exciting. And I guess I was curious, like, given the resources to do prescribed burning now, or especially prescribed burning on private land, like how much of those parcels that were ranked level 9 could we burn now, given the resources that are available?
That's a really good question, Todd. And I think, speaking to that question, especially what we saw during COVID, the reduction there, is that, managers, and I think are, during COVID, and as we're entering into the recovery from COVID, it's always the thing, it's always the problem that you have, 1,000 acres that you want to burn, but you have the resources to burn 500 of those. And how do you prioritize those 500 to get the most bang for your buck? And I think that tools like this will help managers in that decision-making process.
I hope so. It's really cool.
Yeah, Joe, I've got a question too. I was curious. I liked the modeling approach. It looks like you guys have developed kind of a lot of unique input layers to help prioritize and identify places to potentially conserve. In interacting with managers, kind of which of those variables are managers kind of zeroing in on or prioritizing?
Well, sometimes that surprises us. Because like I said, it is really what's unique about it is that it is an iterative process, and that some of the first workshops we did 10 years ago, we basically put up all the different layers and we put them on and gave everybody little colored dots, and they were able to go rank them, what was important to them, and then those became the inputs or the weighted values within the model. And so it is surprising. Now, of course, it's also the audience that you speak to too, because there's the age-old conservation question of do we keep the good, or how far out of rotation, fire rotation might something be that it's still that we really need to put the effort there to recover it. And then there's always the what areas are optimal for restoration. So it really depends on the audience as well as the objective. So.
That makes total sense. Yeah, thanks.
I think everybody had marked out beach time for.
Well, Joe and Casey, I mean, you guys have much more interactions with managers than we do. I think one of the challenges of mapping fires with satellite imagery, or at least for us, is like, where do we invest our time and resources? Do we, like Melanie's work pulling in Sentinel-2, I think really shows the added benefit of having more frequent satellite imagery collected, especially over places like the Southeast. And that's, obviously a direction that we want to expand more. But from the management side, like what's more important? Is it to have like the latest and greatest data for the most recent fires versus like having a great fire history? Because it seems like you guys are really showing the value of those fire histories there. And should we be spending an equal amount of time in trying to like, milk all the information we can from like the 1985 Landsat data or something? Like, I just really want to go back to the 80s. Like Duran Duran was great, man. Just kidding.
I'm sure Casey will have some input on that as well, but I think both are equally as important. Obviously, more improved current fire mapping, will only result in building that history eventually. But I think that as far as managers are concerned, without knowing that fire history and along with other history of what's happened on a specific property, it's very hard to try and come up with a management plan. So.
Yeah, Todd, I think that's a good question. I think definitely, for example, in the Florida stuff or that Southeast longleaf landscape where frequent fire is pretty important for that species. That's one thing where those frequent prescribed fires and wildfires are important, but those species that have a longer fire rotation, having some of that longer data set information is pretty useful. So while I don't think you need to reanalyze 85 every time a new algorithm comes out necessarily, I think that having some sort of baseline with known pros and cons or omission, commission, or whatever can be very helpful in developing those kinds of products. And maybe you add those into the model with a weight as of potentially less accurate because it's further back in time and something like that. But I think having those longer duration detections is important, especially as you move away from the Southeast, where there's longer rotations on some of those, up in Montana and some of the montane areas in Colorado or whatever. So I can see both sides.
I know when we did the Todd, I know when we did the scoping effort for NRCS, that one of the questions in the survey, and I can't remember the exact number, of what was most important to fire managers was that I believe it was a minimum of 10 years history was the consensus among most managers. And that's for the Southeast, obviously. To Casey's point, that would be longer other places.
Right, thanks. Yeah, I remember that survey vaguely, Joe, but I couldn't remember how that answer turned out there. But I think I'm hearing do both.
Got something in the chat here. Well, great. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending the session, and I hope you have a thank you, Todd. Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Melanie. It's great presentations. I hope everybody. Thank you, Jessica, for the keeping us in line and your guidance. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the conference.
Thanks so much, Joe.